In this video, we will dive into most popular React interview questions and coding challenges. And actually, this video is a part of my full course React interview questions, and you can find the link to the React course in the description box below. But if you just want to start with some React challenges, let's jump right into it. Welcome to my course React interview questions. It's so great to have you here. And in this course, we will solve together 41 different topics inside React, which I got or was asked during last 8 years. And all these topics will cover the whole knowledge of React. In this course, you won't just find questions and short answers, but will learn everything that you need to know on this specific topic. In each video, we will implement together a solution on a real example, so you fully understand how to answer different questions on this topic. By the end of this course, you will be much better prepared for your next React interview to get a job. Who am I? My name is Ekaterina, and I'm a web developer with more than 13 years, as well as a professional instructor with various courses regarding web technologies. I did my best to put all my knowledge inside this course, and I want to share it with you. So welcome on board, and let's get started. You might get a question like this: what are the pros and cons of React, and how you can compare it with Angular? The first and the most important point to remember is that React is not a framework, but a lot of people are saying that it is a framework. It is a library. If we are jumping to the official React website, you can see that here it is written that it is a library for web and native user interfaces. Which leads us to the second point: React is not a full-blown framework like, for example, Angular. Inside Angular, we're getting lots of stuff out of the box, like routing, guarding, HTTP request from the API, and much more. Inside React nowadays we still get quite a lot. Previously we got just components and local state and nothing more. But now we have React hooks, and we will talk a lot about React hooks later, but they also bring a lot to the React like a library. It is still not a full-blown framework. If you need, for example, routing, you need to install an additional library. You don't have in React some default way to fetch data from API. There are no things like guarding your routes, organizing your application, or something similar. It is still a library. And we already talked a little bit about cons. It is not a full-blown framework, which actually means you must find every single library that you need additionally to implement stuff that you typically will get inside framework itself, like routing, working with API, and so on. But what are the pros of React? First of all, it is the most popular front-end framework in the world, which means most of front-end developers know it, and there are lots of different jobs with React. Secondly, the level of entrance inside React is not that high. Sure, there are still some difficult things inside React, but it is really easy to start writing your code, create a bunch of components, and see the result on the screen. Additionally to that, because React is so popular, there are hundreds of different libraries. Almost all questions are already answered on Stack Overflow or inside GitHub issues of React, and there are lots of documentation and tutorial to learn React. You might get another question: how do you prefer to generate your React project, and what ways do you know to do that? And actually, if you are jumping inside React website to check how you must generate your React application and what is the recommended way, here on Start New React Project, you will find not the best idea. Why is that? Because here it is saying only about production-grade React frameworks, like Next.js. But essentially, this is not what everybody needs to develop their React application. Because Next.js brings server-side rendering to the table, and not everybody needs that. And actually, there are lots of easier solutions which are not written here. Here we're getting like Next.js, Remix, Gatsby, Expo, and so on. Essentially, what we're typically using to create React applications, and what we used for years, is called Create React App. Previously, it was a standard to create React applications because it brought the whole project with a web server in a matter of seconds. You can still use it, it is totally fine, but it is quite slow. And additionally to that, there are better ways to do that just because they are newer and faster. And the fastest solution to create a React application, and not only React, but also other projects like plain JavaScript, plain TypeScript, React, React with TypeScript, Vue, and so on, is called Vite. Vite is a special tool which allows you to generate all these projects really easily through command line. It is much faster than Create React App because it leverages new things and does not support all the browsers. But actually this question is more about preference and what ways you know than just the strict answer. So if you want something to build your project really fast, Vite is the way to go. You might also get questions like this. What makes React so powerful? What is Virtual DOM? And what is the difference between Virtual DOM and Shadow DOM? And from the second question you can already guess the answer to the first question. Yes, Virtual DOM is the major feature inside React, and this is exactly why React is so powerful. So what is Virtual DOM? Virtual DOM is a lightweight JavaScript representation of DOM or Document Object Model used in a declarative framework such as React, Vue or Elm. What does it mean? We have a DOM tree, and to render something inside browser, we need to create DOM nodes inside this DOM tree. This is a slow process. This is why things like jQuery that we used previously were not that efficient. Additionally to that, when we're working with DOM nodes as it is too much code and it is too difficult to support. Inside React we have a declarative way where we're creating components like a tree, and then the whole application is simply working without our knowledge about DOM tree at all inside browser. How does it work? React uses virtual DOM inside. What does it mean? So we created a tree of the components inside React, and then React builds a virtual DOM from these components. What is virtual DOM? This is just a huge object which is a representation of the real DOM, which actually means, let's say we have 5 DOM nodes inside DOM, then we will have 5 properties inside this virtual DOM object inside React. Which actually means React doesn't directly use DOM. When it makes comparison between your old state and the new state of the components, it first compares your changes inside JavaScript through virtual DOM. And only if you made some changes and React understood what changes were made, it applies these changes to the real DOM. And it makes it really fast to work with, and we can write our code in declarative way without knowing at all about existing of DOM. So we already answered what is virtual DOM, and now the question is what is the difference between virtual DOM and shadow DOM. And actually this is kind of funny question because these are two completely not related things, and shadow DOM is not related at all to React. But people hear two words which are kind of similar, and they typically think that Shadow DOM is also related to React, and they try to guess what it is. So let's have a look. You already know what is Virtual DOM, but what is Shadow DOM? Shadow DOM allows hidden DOM trees to be attached to elements inside regular DOM tree. Actually, Shadow DOM doesn't have anything to do with React. This is why we won't even talk about it. Most importantly, you must know Shadow DOM and React doesn't have anything in common. We're not using Shadow DOM inside React. React is built with Virtual DOM and not Shadow DOM. The next question that you might get is what is JS6 and if it is a part of React or not. So JS6 is a markup that we are writing inside React. And inside React we're creating JavaScript files, so we don't write some HTML files like we're doing in other frameworks. We're writing our markup directly inside JavaScript files. And it brings lots of benefits because you have direct access to all your properties and you simply return markup that you need to. So what is JS6? This is a syntax extension for JavaScript that lets you to write HTML like markup. The most important point is that JS6 is not HTML at all. We're writing plain JavaScript functions, but they look like JS6. Because essentially JS6 is being converted to plain functions. And here is the answer to the second question. JS6 and React are two completely different things. You can write JSX without React, and you can write React without JSX. But obviously nobody is doing that, everybody is simply using JSX inside React. But this is an additional library that is used inside React in order to bring markup inside our library. And additionally to that, if you don't know how JSX looks like, this is simply a return inside your component where you are writing just normal markup like always. Another question that you might get is why can't we use class word inside JSX markup and why we're using class name instead? So here I have an app component and the question is why here inside our div we can't write class, for example app, but we're writing class name instead. And as you can see, my editor directly showed the error that we don't have a known property class, we must use class name instead, so we must write like this. The main point is that we're writing not HTML, but we're writing JavaScript. And inside JavaScript, class is a reserved word. This is why we will have a collision if we're using class directly inside our markup. The keyword class is being used to create ECMAScript 6 classes inside JavaScript like this. So we're writing class, then foo, and we have some methods inside. So this class will collide with our markup. This is why inside JSX we have class name instead. And obviously the most popular mistake that people are making, they are writing class inside markup and not a class name. Another question that you might get is what are functional components inside React and how we can pass props to the functional components. So what you saw in the previous video, our app is actually a functional component. What does it mean? It is just a function which returns some markup. And this markup is actually a JSX markup. Functional components are bread and butter of React. The whole tree of our components is just a bunch of functional components that we're using in one another. Most important point to remember is that our functional component does not have any state inside. We can't really store here some variable and then mutate it later with the click. Every single time when we're rendering this component, everything will be recreated, which actually means we don't have any state inside our component. We simply render something and we're good to go. And if you think now, okay, but what about useStateHook? We will talk about it in a later videos. Now let's try to create a functional component so you see on the example how it works. Let's say that we want a component, button, and as you can see here, we're writing all our components with capital letter. And this is just a function which returns some markup. For example, here we want to return our button just like in plain HTML. And now inside we can render some text, like for example button. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have a membership here on the channel that you can join to support me. It will give you access to the new videos earlier, emojis and priority replies to your comments. Now here inside our app component, we can render our button component. So we're just rendering one functional component inside other. As you can see in browser, we're getting our button, which was rendered inside our app. And the next question is what are props inside React and why do we need them at all? And obviously we want to pass some information to our components. This is why we need props. Typically you want from your parent to pass some properties to the child. For example, let's say that we want to provide text inside our button component. This is why we're getting props as a second parameter, and now here we can provide some props just like normal attributes inside. For example, we can write here text, and this is a string hi React, and then this property text will come inside this props. So here we can render the property with props.text. And all our properties are inside brackets. As you can see in browser, we successfully rendered here information which was passed through the props to child component. But actually people typically don't write code like this. They are not defining props here directly, because then in all your places in child component you need to write props.text, props.icon, and this is not comfortable. This is why typically you just destructure here your first argument and you are getting all your properties, like for example text directly here. And now props are not defined, so I can just use text like a local variable inside our button. And as you can see here, it is working, we're getting here high React. And additionally to that, you might want to set a default value if the value is not provided. Like for example here text, we can write not set. And now if outside we didn't provide our text, our component won't break. Instead we will see here not set text, and then developer will understand that he didn't provide correct property inside our component. So we're using props inside React in order to pass some information to our child component. Another question that you might get is how to create class components, how to pass props inside class components, and how to create a state inside class components. And just from the beginning, I want to tell you that class approach is an older approach inside React. It is not deprecated, but it is still not a recommended approach nowadays, which actually means you can get a project where they still use classes, but most of the projects nowadays just have functional components. Nevertheless, you must know how to work with class, it is not that difficult. And in order to do that, let's refactor our components, app and button to the class approach. This is why I will comment everything out and just create first of all an app. So in order to create a class component, we're using a reserved word class, and we're using extends because we want to extend from React.component. And as you can see here, I got an auto import React from React. Now inside our class, in order to return some markup, we must use a render function. And inside it, we must return markup, just like we wrote previously inside the functional component. So here we will have return div class name app, and here is our button. But our button is not defined, so we must create one more class. It is our button, and again we're using extends from React.component. And here we must also create a render function because we want to return some markup. And here it will be our button with text inside. Obviously we can just write here button and it will work. As you can see in browser, our button is ready, but we really want to pass some information to our button class. And as previously with functional components, we are passing information to the child element by using props. So here what we can write, just like previously, text equals hello React. Now the question is how to get access to this text inside our class. And here we can render this dot props, and this is exactly where we are getting all our props, dot, and in our case it will be text. As you can see in browser, we rendered hello React button. So all your props are situated inside these props, and you can use them in any function of our class. But inside class we have two more important things that we don't have inside functional components. And first of all, we have inside state, which actually means our class can have a local state inside and we can change it. And even if our component is re-rendered, we don't have a problem and this local state is staying there. In order to create a state, we can simply create a property state, and it is an object with some properties inside. For example, here we can create a counter state, and let's set it to 0. Now let's say that every single time when we're clicking on our button, we want to increase our counter. First of all, what I want to do here, I want to render not only text, but also this state counter, which actually means we can access all properties inside our state by using this state. Now the only question is how to update this state. And here we can apply onClick function and just call an anonymous function here with this dot set state. And this is a special function which will update our state. Inside we are passing an object with our counter. And let's say that we want to make this dot state dot counter +1. In this case, every single time when we're clicking on the button, we're increasing our counter, which is situated inside our state. Let's have a look. Here by default we're getting 0. I'm clicking on our button and we're getting 1, 2, 3 and so on, which actually means our local state works and it is not resetted or removed when our component is rendered every single time when we're making a change to our state. So the main difference between class components and functional components is that inside classes by default we are getting a possibility to store state, and we don't have that possibility inside functional components without hooks, but we will talk about hooks later. Another important difference from functional components is that inside class components we have lifecycle hooks. which actually means we have different states in life of our component. Like for example, component was created, or props were changed, or component was destroyed. For example, here we can define component did mount, and this is a lifecycle hook which will be called when our component is mounted to the DOM. So here I can just write console log created button, and as you can see inside the console we're getting created button method because our lifecycle hook called this console log when our class was created. So just to sum it up, classes is an older approach which is not really used nowadays because we have functional components and hooks. Also inside classes out of the box we have state, which we can change, and lifecycle hooks which can help us to work with our component. You might get a question like this: what are dump and smart components, and what are presentational versus container components? And actually these two questions are completely similar. Dump components and presentational components is the same stuff, and smart components and container components are also the same stuff. So these are not two different things, this is the same. We're talking here about dump or presentational components and smart or container components. So what is the difference? Let's have a look on our example from the previous video. Here we used class approach to create two different components. We have here a button and we have here an app. And essentially an app is a presentational component because it doesn't have any logic inside, any state inside. It simply renders some data on the screen. In our case here we just render this markup and we don't do anything else. So we can name it dump component or presentational component. But what about this component button? It is a smart component or container component. Why that? At least because we have a state inside. If your component has a state inside, that means it is a smart or container component. And typically in your application, you are splitting the whole application in different components. You have some components which just render something on the screen, and you have some components where you have the difficult business logic, and then these are container components. You might also get another question: how to render a list of data inside React, and what is key and why it is bad to use an index inside. So first of all, let's look how to render a list of data inside React. So let's make it real, and we want to render a list of our users. Let's make this list here. We have a users, and this is an array of objects. We have here ID 1 and name foo, and we have here ID 2 and ID 3, and name will be bar and bus. So this is our list. Now inside our markup we want to render this list. In order to do that, we are using brackets and we are writing inside users map, so all our loops we are doing with map. And here inside we are getting access to every single user, and we can just return markup. This is why here directly we can write div and render inside our user.name. As you can see in browser, our code works and we successfully rendered a list of users. But here is the problem: we are getting inside console a warning: each child in the list should have a unique key prop. And essentially this is our question: what is key and why it is bad to use index for it? The main point is that in order for React to understand our array and know how to render it efficiently, we must provide in every single element a key attribute, which actually means doesn't really matter if we're rendering inside a div or a component, we must provide here inside a key. And typically people are using inside the key an index. Why that? Because the index is something that we can easily obtain from any array, and inside map this is a second parameter. So we're writing here key and we're providing inside our index. And as you can see, we're not getting an error anymore. Our list is there, we're reloading the page, and we don't have any warning. This is what most people are writing. Is this code bad? When we're looking on the question, it sounds like it is bad and we should not use an index inside a key. But does it really so? Obviously not. If you don't change your array, you don't add new elements, you don't remove elements, and you don't reorder your array, then it is totally fine to use indexes. But if you do with your array some stuff that I just named, then indexes are bad. Why is that? Because you might, after that, get access to not correct element when you are trying to change your array. And it happens because you simply removed one index inside your array and your array was updated. This is why actually it is a good practice to avoid using indexes but use some unique identifier. And typically when you want to render a list, you are rendering a list of entities, like for example users, that you might get from the API. And typically your entities always have an ID inside. And this is the awesome unique identifier because we are totally sure that this is really unique and we can safely remove or add users by this unique identifier and we will never get the same identifier. Which means in this case we can safely remove index here and instead of index inside key we can provide user.id because we know that it is unique. As you can see now here we don't have any errors and we're 100% sure that we won't have a problem with adding or removing elements to our array. You might get a question like this: what is React.Fragment? Do you know how to read a shorter version of it? So sometimes inside React we want to render DOM node but without a DOM element. What does it mean? Let's say that you have some markup and you want to avoid creating an additional element. For example, in previous video we rendered a list of our users with divs inside. And here is how markup looks like. We have here a div with class app and we have 3 divs inside. It might be just fine for you, but sometimes you have some styling that does not allow you to create new nested elements. Or for example, you have markup like a table and then it is difficult to add loops there because you are creating additional wrappers. This is why what we want to do, we want to somehow remove DOM nodes that we don't need. For example, let's say that in this example, we don't need these divs. How we can use users map and render an element inside without this div? And this is exactly where we can leverage React.Fragment. It is something that we are writing inside our markup, but React won't render it. Yes, we can use it for wrapping several elements or for rendering our loop like here, but it won't be visible in your DOM tree. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have lots of advanced courses on different web technologies where we create real applications and prepare for the interviews. You can find the link in the description box below. This is why here I want to remove a div and write React.Fragment. And here we must close it with React.Fragment. And as you can see additionally for that, I must import React from React. We don't get any errors, let's look in browser. And now inside our div, we have an app, and inside app we have just 3 strings, foo, bar and buzz, but we don't have these div wrappers. And yes, we can see here React.Fragment, but this is only in our markup, it is not visible inside browser. So mostly you're using React.Fragment when you want to avoid creating DOM nodes, like for example for your difficult styling or for creating difficult elements like tables. And the second question here was, do you know the short version of React.Fragment? The shorter version I want to show you here on the top. We just have an open and close tag, but we don't write anything inside at all. And now here I just want to write short version of fragment. As you can see, my editor goes crazy because it doesn't understand that this is a valid syntax. But actually in browser you can see that it works. Inside app we have short version of fragment and it is not wrapped in any element. This is just a plain text, which actually means this is really the shorter version of React.Fragment component. And the first problem here, it is not really supported in all editors, which actually means if you have lots of developers in your team, it might be better to write just a full version React.Fragment and not a short one. The second problem why I don't like short version is because you might think that in this case, where we used React.Fragment, we can use short notation. And we can't because we're using here key. So I can't really remove here everything and just leave key and remove here React.Fragment. This is not a valid code at all. As you can see in browser, we are getting errors regarding unexpected token. And it happens because this is not a valid code when we want to write some attributes inside short version. This is why I highly recommend you in all cases to just write React.Fragment. It is not that long or difficult, and then all people can easily understand it and any editor can read it. You might get a question like this: what do you know about conditional rendering inside React? And obviously here we're talking about if condition that we can use to render our content. Let's have a look on our app. Here we just have a div and let's write inside app. As you can see in browser, we see our app content. But what if we want to write if condition based on some logic? Let's write here property is loading and set it to true. Obviously in the real application we will write some logic to change it depending on different situation. But what we want to do here, we want just to write an if condition because this is a plain JavaScript. We can write here if we have is loading property, then we need to return other markup. For example, here is a div with text loading. And actually we will never come to this case because this loading isn't true. Let's look in browser. Now here we see just loading indicator and we don't see our app content at all. Which actually means the most basic conditional rendering inside React is just by using if condition and returning the markup that you want to. And actually this is amazing because it simplifies your code a lot. Sometimes you really want to nest if you have this, then you need to check that inside and so on, and you have nested if conditions. This is always a bad approach because it makes your code more difficult to read. You can avoid that if you will just go out of the component as soon as possible. For example, here we are not writing some difficult logic regarding is loading and app content. We simply go out of our component at the moment when is loading is true. We just return this and we don't check any other stuff. Which means we can just write like 5 different cases here and this code will be easily supportable. Another possibility here would be to write a ternary operator. So instead of this if here, we can write directly in return is loading, then question mark, and if it is loading, then we want to write a loading indicator here. In another case, we just put a colon and we return our markup. This is a ternary operator, and as this is just a plain JavaScript, it works just fine. Yes, sure, we are not returning here some variable or function, we return here a markup, but it is totally fine for React. As you can see in browser, again, we are getting no errors, and we see here loading indicator, but now through ternary operator. And you can imagine that the amount of code here in ternary operator can be really huge. For example, if here we write the whole content of our application, it is not that readable. What we can do instead, we can create several additional components. For example, here we can create a loading indicator, and this is just a component where we're returning loading stuff. And then instead of this div, we simply render loading component. This code is valid and really easy to read. We can do exactly the same stuff and call it main. And maybe here we're just rendering this div that we wrote here on the right. So here we will render our main component, and we just need to move this content inside. Now we can increase the amount of the content in both of these components, and it won't make our ternary operator less readable. And the last thing that we can do, we can render some logic inside our markup based on the condition. What does it mean? Let's say that here we want to return this markup. So here inside the div, we are just rendering our app inside. But let's say that also we want to render here our loading component when is loading property isn't true. Here we can just put brackets and write is loading and we're rendering here our loading component. So what this code does, it executes this condition, and if it isn't true, then it renders this specific component. Actually, this is a plain JavaScript. You could jump to the console and write here false and foo. As you can see, we're getting false, so nothing will be rendered. If we're writing here true and foo, then we're getting foo back. This is exactly what we're doing here inside React. We're rendering loading component only if our isLoading property isn't true. This is amazing when you need to render some component based on the condition, but you don't really need to use a ternary operator. Which actually means we have just 3 main ways to use conditional rendering inside React. First of all, just if and return what we need to. Secondly, ternary operator. And the third one is a condition inside brackets where we're rendering component based on this condition. You might get a question like this: how to apply styles inside React and how you can apply several classes conditionally. So let's look on our app, and actually here we already wrote class name, and this is exactly how we apply classes to our DOM elements inside React. But this is just a class, it doesn't have any styling inside. And actually inside React we don't have anything which creates isolated styling. What we're typically doing, we just create some file with our styling, like app CSS, and we're writing styles for it inside. For example, here we have a class app, and we want just to say background green. The next step that we must do is import this CSS file to our component. As you can see in browser now, our app component has green styling. But most importantly, here on the right, we have our styling, and this is just a global CSS class, which actually means it doesn't really matter how many files for styling you create, like 10, 20, you can import them in any place, but they will have global styling. React doesn't have isolated styling at all, this is all global, and our class names are using global styling. But also we have another way to bring styling inside our component. As we're writing here JavaScript, we can simply provide all our styles inside objects, and then we will have them inline. For example, here we can write app styles, and this is just an object, and let's say that we need again background green. And we're writing here green as a string, and all our styles that we need here will be camel cased if they were with dash inside plain CSS. Like for example here comma, and we're writing margin top, and here will be 20 pixels. Now here, in order to apply these styles instead of class name, we're using style attribute, and we're providing inside our app styles. Let's have a look. It is green and it has margin, and now it is just inline styles, which means they are not global, they are just inline. And as these are just objects, you can simply spread them, merge them, delete some properties from them, and they are quite flexible. But obviously this is JavaScript and inline styles. Plain CSS is always better as it is native, and your performance will be much better. But you might also think, okay, but all my styling is global, what I can do regarding it? And there are lots of different libraries that allow you to write isolated styling for every single component. And the most popular library is probably style components. It allows you to write your styles with conditions, and it simply creates different components. For example, here in the example, you can see that we have a button component, and here they used a specific word styled a because they want to create a link, and they have some logic and some styling just inside the plain string. Most importantly, this will be a reusable component that they can use anywhere, and all these styles will be isolated inside this button. They won't be global. And this is not the library that you can just pick, there are lots of them and you can compare them if you need to isolate your styles. And our next question here was how to apply several classes conditionally. And actually this is a really good question because lots of people are doing that in not efficient or not human readable way. So let's say that we have several classes and we want to apply them. You typically write here class name and you're providing inside several classes like foo, bar and bus. This is totally fine, it is readable. But what can we do if our bar class must be applied with the condition? Then it won't be readable. Why is that? Typically people are writing here a variable and they're using ECMAScript 6 syntax inside. They're closing here their string, and then instead of the bar, they're writing here a variable with ternary operator. Like for example, is active, then here we will have bar class. In another case, we will have here an empty string. And now here, let's just for testing create is active in true. As you can see in browser, this code is working, we're getting foo bar buzz, but this code is not readable at all because we're packing all this stuff just in a single property. Sure, we could move it out, like for example bar class, and then instead we're using here bar class. It is a little bit more readable, but still can be better because when we're writing this code again and again in different places of our application, this is not cool. In order to solve this problem and make your code really readable, I highly recommend you to look on the library which is called classNames. As you can see, there are lots of usages here, but you are interested just in a single usage. So here on the top I want to import this classNames library from classNames, and now what I want to do here is create app classes, and app classes will be at the end a string. But here I am calling classNames and I'm providing inside an object. Now here we can provide different conditions for different properties. In this case here we know, okay, foo and buzz are classes which are always there. We're writing here foo as a key, this is our class, and the value will be true. Then we have buzz as a key and the value will be true. It means that these two classes will be applied always. But now here we have a bar class and here we have a condition, which means it is not true. Sometimes it can be false. We're writing here is active, which means that if this property isn't true, then bar class will be applied. If this property isn't false, then we won't get it. And now we don't need to do all this weird stuff. We simply return here class name app classes. And this code is easy to read just because we have here nice logic with the object. Let's have a look in browser. We're getting here foo buzz bar because this is active is true. We're setting it to false and we're getting just two classes foo and buzz. So class names is a really good solution if you need to apply some classes conditionally. You might get a question like this: how parent and child components can communicate inside React, and can we mutate props? So actually we already talked a little bit regarding props when we created a child component and rendered it inside our app. Let's look on it once again. We created a child component like button and we got here props, and actually we destroyed it to get a property like text. Now inside here we can just return our markup, which is button. And we're rendering some text inside, which means we have now a child component button, and now inside our app we can render this button component. The only thing that we need to do is provide text inside through the props. Here we're assigning text, for example, hello React. As you can see in browser, inside our app component we successfully rendered the button hello React. This is exactly a part of communication between parent and child. In this case, app is our parent component and button is our child component. And what we are doing, we are providing props from our parent to the child. And it is always like that. We are providing our props from top to bottom and never in opposite direction, which actually means button can't provide any props to our app. Only app can provide props to our button. And additionally to that, props are read-only. This is exactly our second question. We can't really mutate our props because they are read-only inside React, and this is so by design. But now you for sure have a question: okay, we are providing props from parent to child, but how we can tell our parent something from our child component? And in order to do that, we are still using props. Let's say here we want click on the button. We're creating here an attribute button click, and inside we're calling a function. So what function we would call? And actually this function must come from the props in order to give some information to our parent. For example, here we can create a function on button click, and we're providing inside on button click function. So what is on button click? We must create this function inside our app, and here we have just a function where inside we want to console log on button click in parent. Our next step would be to add this on button click to our props inside button component, and now here we want to call this on button click function with round brackets here inside on click, which actually means still we are not providing anything from our child to the parent. This prop on button click we are providing from parent to the child, and we simply use it inside our child. As you can see in browser here, I can click on hello React button, and now we're getting console log on button click in parent, which actually means this is our possibility to tell our parent that something happened in the child, like we clicked on the button. But now for sure you have a question, okay, but how we can provide some information and not just an event? And in order to do that, we can simply provide anything that we want inside this onButtonClick function. We can provide like 5 different arguments or an object. This is all going just fine. So here we can just provide for testing a string hello, and now onButtonClick function that we are creating here will get a value from our child. And now here we can render this value. We don't really know what is a value. It can be an object, a string, an array, but we're console logging it here. Let's have a look. I'm clicking on Hello React and we're getting onButtonClick in parent hello, which actually means this hello is just a value that we provided from child to parent. So in order to implement parent-child communication inside React, we're using only props and nothing else. And these props are going from top to bottom and they are read-only. And additionally to that, if you're familiar with Angular and you're thinking about something like services, which is a shareable thing which we can share between different components to reuse our code or functionality, we don't have something like this inside React. We don't have any services, we just have communication through props. And yes, it is for sure possible to create some global object or service that will give us access in different components for different methods, but we will talk about it later. And this was the end of the first chapter. If you're interested to learn React interview questions even further, make sure to check the link in the description box below.